The scene was idyllic. A Norman Rockwell painting of family life. Of course this one would never have made the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. My mother-in-law stood on the left side of the hospital bed, my mother stood on the right, both gazing lovingly at the bed's two occupants, my wife, and her one-day-old baby latched onto her and feeding. Newborn babies are not cute. Far from it, but of course parents and grandparents think otherwise. But as I watched, I had to agree this little girl was not bad-looking. At least the mottled red of her face had changed to a light pinkish color. The waxy vernix that looked like lard and had covered her the day before had been washed away. Even her cone hat-shaped skull was already rounding out nicely. I suspected that in time she would grow to resemble the woman she was latched onto, Susan, my wife of the past 6 years, and the love of my life. My wife sat in the bed covered to the waist but bare above that. Although they were now engorged by the hormones causing them to swell and produce milk, my wife's melons had always been large and firm. While she was proud of them and called them her best feature, she had a great body overall, and everyone who knew her would describe her as cute. She had that bubbly girl next door quality about her. Now she pushed her assets forward for the little thing to feed. Part of me was enjoying the scene. Part of me was repelled, not by view, but what it represented. I stood quietly and watched Susan nurse the baby, while both her mother and mine coached her needlessly. I say needlessly because Susan was a natural. Plus she and I had attended hours of parenting classes that included feeding instruction, as well as the rest of newborn child care. I stepped to one side as the labor and delivery nurse and another woman knocked and then stepped into the room. This is Ms. Denkins from admin. She has the application for the certificate of live birth for you to fill out, the nurse, whose name escaped me, said. A brief thought flashed through my mind how this would be surreal in any other setting of our society. A woman sitting bare-chested nursing a baby while others discussed business. Here it was a usual occurrence. Don't rush. Finish nursing your baby. Ms. Denkins instructed Susan. When you get a little time, fill in the information in the highlighted blanks. Of course your hospital records already have most of the information we need, like place and date of birth, but we will need your and your husband's full names, and your maiden name, your ages, and several other things. Take your time. We will enter the rest and submit it to the parish courthouse for you. You will get a copy of the birth certificate itself in the mail in a couple weeks. With that, Ms. Denkins turned and left. Honey, why don't you take this and fill out the information? After all, I am kinda busy right now. Susan suggested with a smile I did not return. No, I think I'll let you fill it out later when your hands aren't full. I answered. Besides, I think we should wait until the DNA tests come back to know if I am the father or not. If this were a scene in a movie you might hear the screech of the needle as it scratched across the record. All movement stopped. For those of you who were born in the digital age and don't know what a record is, it is a disc made of vinyl onto which sound was embossed mechanically with a stylus into grooves. With the use of a needle following those grooves and the magic of electricity, the sound was recreated. But I digress. To say my audience was shocked would be an understatement. 3 of the 4 females stared at me, frozen with mouths agape. The 4th, the baby, was the only one not looking, and the only one to make a sound when the nip she had been sucking was pulled forcefully from her mouth. Her wail did not quite block the loud gasps the 3 women made collectively. My mother-in-law was the first to react. Are you out of your mind? Why would you even think such thing? Then she looked at Susan, whose face showed astonishment, morphing into speculation, and then to an angry glare. How dare you accuse me of having another man's baby? What kind of woman do you think I am? Then she stopped and attempted a smile that did not quite work. Oh, I get it, today is April Fool's Day. You are pranking us. Well, that kind of joke is not funny. You should know better. Her body posture belied her words. Her shock was evident. I stood there watching her. Oh, I'm not kidding in the least. I stated coldly. I'm sure a strong possibility exists that I am not the father. How could you think I'd ever cheat on you? Have I ever given you the slightest reason to suspect me? Name one time I did. Just one time I gave you any reason to think I was seeing someone else. Instead of answering her question, I said. So you went with your default response. Deny, deny, deny. And you were even doing it with a straight face. I'm impressed. I turned to my mother-in-law. Perhaps I should move the car seat from my car to yours, so you can take her and the baby home this afternoon. I hope you can stay with Susan for a while. I know both you and Mom offered several times, but we told you we could handle it. She could use the help since I am not going to be there. I turned to walk out of the room and only stopped because I reacted automatically to the terse command from behind. Stop right there, Jason Luce Fontanet. My mother's voice reached out and froze me in place. You do not just walk away after a statement like that. I turned and stood in place like the obedient son I'd been raised to be as I formulated my response. Both Mom and my mother-in-law looked back and forth between me and Susan, who had now started crying hysterically. "No, you can't leave me and little Connie. She is our baby. You're her daddy." Before I answered my own mother, I answered my wife. "I know I am supposed to be the daddy, but am I the father? There is a difference, you know." My mom caught my attention with a jab to my chest. She had closed the short gap between us and grabbed the front of my shirt and pulled me close to look me straight in the eye, just like she'd done when I was a child. "What the duck is wrong with you, Jason? Why are you acting like a brain-dead idiot now all of a sudden? You can't be getting cold feet about being a father. That time has passed. You've been over the moon since Sue first announced she was pregnant. Damn it. You've been running around reading every book written about taking care of babies. You bought and assembled the crib, changing table and everything else in that nursery. Not to mention you painted the walls pink and yellow with little animals all over. Every damn week you bring home a new toy for that baby. Hell, some of them she won't be able to use until she starts walking." Mom finally took a breath as she stared intensely into my eyes. "So why the change now?" "I've had a little revelation," I said. "I'm not so on board with the program. I'm sure you noticed." "Yeah. Tony," my mother-in-law piped up from the side. "We all noticed you have not once held Connie or even looked really closely at her. We thought it funny and figured the reality of being a parent was just now hitting you. What the hell is going on? If that baby is mine, I'll step up and take care of her. I'll do my best to be the best damn dad I can," I said with an intensity that made both my mother and Tony step back. I was totally into being a dad. But that ended last week when I found out I might not be the ducking father. I am not going to connect with a baby that I am not going to help raise. "What?" came from three voices, not quite simultaneously but close enough. "I'll support the baby if she is mine, but if not, Clive Adams can step up and support his own kid," I announced loudly. Hearing that name, Susan suddenly screamed. "Clive and I never did anything. We never had sex. How can you say that?" Mom and Tony looked back and forth between Susan and I as I stepped to the foot of her bed. "Really? You're still going to deny you and he did not have sex, did not have an affair for almost 6 months? And that you broke it off 7 months ago only after you found out you were pregnant and told him? From what I understand, he told you to make sure I never found out he might be the one to have done the deed." "No, we did not, and anybody who says that is a damn liar," Susan yelled. "Who the hell is Clive Adams and who told you they had an affair?" Tony demanded. "I want to know who is spreading stories about my daughter." I ignored the first question. My answer to the second question was simple. "Clive Adams himself," I said quietly. Before she could think, and probably because she was a bit sleep-deprived and obviously distraught, Susan screamed, "Clive would never tell you that. He promised." Tony looked from me to her daughter and back. She caught what Susan had said. "I need to know what you know." I ignored her for a second or two, then addressed my wife. "Clive confessed it all and told me all about you. Of course, I had his balls in a vice at the time, so he told me everything between his screams," I said. "Bullshit. Clive was fine yesterday when he called to check on me and the baby." Susan screamed back. She was stressed, having just undergone childbirth and might not have realized what she said. But her words rang true. All three of us heard her. Tony slumped momentarily. I glanced at my own mother who stood wide-eyed, taking it all in. "So you are still talking to your old boyfriend?" I offered. "Did he offer you any more words of advice or encouragement about how to keep me in the dark about his possibly being the father?" Susan began to bawl. Her screeches were so strident, 2 nurses rushed into the room. "We were so careful. You could not have known. Nobody knew." "She's had a little shock," I said in explanation to the first nurse. To give her credit, she glared at me in defense of her patient. I guess my tone of voice was a little off to her way of reckoning. We were discussing possible fathers for her to name on the birth certificate application. The nurse still stared at me. Well, apparently she expects me to write my name in the space. I want to wait to see if I am the father or it's the asshole she was having an affair with when she got knocked up. I could see the light was coming on by the nurse's change of expression. She turned her attention to soothing Susan. "Ms. Fontenot, let's calm down now. Big breaths, just like you did when you were in labor. Cheryl will go get something for you to take that will calm you a bit if that doesn't work. We really don't want to have to give you something that might get into your milk, do we? So let's try a natural method first. Breathe with me. Take a big breath." I was watching the nurse work her magic calming Susan, and did not see both Mom and my mother-in-law step close. "You better explain what the duck is going on," Mom hissed in a low voice. I was shocked. Mom usually did not use that word. Today she'd used it twice already. "Something happened. That is obvious from Sue's reaction," my mother-in-law stated. "I want to know what, when, and how." This is totally out of the blue. Well, that should be obvious, I said, glaring back at both women. I was getting pissed. I was the subject of their ire and not Susan. She was screwing a guy she works with when she got pregnant. Well, one guy other than me. One guy I know of for sure, anyway. I have no idea if there were others. Susan got control of herself remarkably quickly for a woman seemingly on the verge of a breakdown moments before. How? We were so careful, she asked pitifully. I got the look from Mom and Tony as well. They wanted to know. Yes, you were very discreet. I had no idea. Nor did anybody else, I admitted. Unfortunately, Clive is the consummate salesman. In order to get his next sale, or in this case, latest seduction, he had to prove himself. You know Cheryl Watkins, of course. She nodded. I knew she did, as she and Cheryl had worked in the same office for the past few years. Cheryl and her husband Steve were friends and we ran in the same circles. Well, Clive worked on Cheryl and had her almost convinced to go with him to a rented hotel room. Her sticking point was that Clive might let the cat out of the bag and her husband would find out. She was just not sure she could trust him to keep his mouth shut. To show he knew the value of discretion, he told her of a few of his earlier, what would you call them, conquests, liaisons, girlfriends. He named a few names and gave enough details to convince her. He asked her if she'd heard of anybody he might have been with. Not the few girlfriends he was dating publicly, but of any married women, or even single women around the office for that matter. Of course she could not. So to convince her he could keep a secret, he named a few women at the office she knew. The one before you was Sandy, I believe. She got cold feet after a few months when she worried her husband was getting suspicious. Then you for 6 months, but you broke it off when you found out you were pregnant. He said you hoped your husband was the baby's father, but he was not willing to keep the affair going. He told Cheryl it was crucial her husband, meaning me, would never find out because he might toss Sue to the curb, and I sure don't want to be saddled with child support. At the time you were quite vocal and let everybody know when you got pregnant. You were very happy and made it known to everybody at the office as soon as you found out. I did not add that while Susan was excited about being pregnant, she did not seem a bit concerned about her baby's parentage. I suppose she figured I'd never suspect, and even if I did, I'd be invested in the child and give her a pass. That was not on the table as far as I am concerned. Apparently, Lana Richard was his next lover. Her husband got upset about her suddenly working late, and she had to cover her tracks. She was late picking up their youngest kid at daycare a few times when it was her turn. So with that downturn in his sex life, Clive turned his attention to Cheryl and scored again. Like I said, the consummate salesman, he told her what she needed to hear to drop her panties. Apparently he was fairly proficient in bed as well. He kept his married women happy and willing to come back to him for months at a time. Tony and Mom looked at me and then Susan. How should I say, why did Cheryl make the supposed confession then? Mom asked. Not on purpose. Seems Cheryl likes to get vocal when having sex, I said. She called out Clive's name in the heat of passion. Her husband, Steve, grilled her and she talked. I grinned for a second as I remembered what Steve had said as he related his story over beer or 3. Cheryl was not one to just yell oh God, and issue guttural screams like NNNNGGH. And NNNNGH, I'm coming, like Susan does in the throes of oh. Cheryl likes to talk and put her desires into words. Like dug me harder. I need your clock. Apparently one night she and her husband, Steve, were getting it on and Cheryl screamed out, give it to me, Clive. Pound my kitty with your big clock. Fill me up. I love it when you do me hard. I resumed my explanation. Steve does not sound anything like Clive, and Steve of course knew Clive and was well aware of his reputation as a ladies' man, or rather what us guys call a kitty hound. He put 2 and 2 together and came up with 16. Steve got in Cheryl's face. That was how he put it to me when Larry, Lana's husband, was there. He was a little concerned Larry, being a cop, might say something about him telling his wife, which, you better start talking. If you don't, I'm going to have to decide if I want to beat you to a pulp or choke you to death before I feed your ass to the gators in the swamp. She decided talking was the smart way out. Steve is an honest man and an honorable one. He told me, Jason, I just felt I needed to let you know you might not be the father of that baby in your wife's belly. I'd like to think you'd tell me if you found out my wife was cheating. I assured him I certainly would. As we sat there we pondered Clive's fate. To tell you the truth, if he is that baby's father, I'll let him have the kid and the witch attached. He'll piss himself trying to pay support, I said. I'll let him know if he doesn't do right by the baby he might not have the equipment to screw around anymore. Steve told me Clive might not have his equipment that much longer as it was. He was going to tell Sandy's husband, who he did not know as well as he knew Larry and me. He remembered the guy vaguely from high school as having a quick temper and might reveal what we knew too soon. He agreed to hold off for a week to let Susan have her kid without the added stress of her affair being known publicly. Larry was hopping mad himself but agreed to keep quiet for another week or so as well. Now that the baby was here, it was time to reveal all about Clive and his women. I gave Tony and Mom a sanitized version of the story. Both appreciated my not rocking the boat during Sue's last stages. Tony and Mom pushed me into the hallway where we could discuss this without upsetting Susan anymore. The second nurse had whisked the baby, Connie, off to the nursery for the time being. "So how are you so calm?" Mom asked. "I can tell you are upset, but not nearly as much as I'd expect." My answer that I've had a full week to come to grips with the situation appeased her a little. "Okay, you've had time to think. I'm sure you will let me, us, know when you are ready." Mom knew me well. "So when are you going to take the samples for the DNA test?" Tony wanted to know. She was a little surprised to know they'd already been submitted. I talked with the head nurse yesterday after the birth. Because Susan and I were married, I was already the supposed father, so did not need Susan's permission to test the baby. I paid for an expedited test, and it would take 2 to 3 days to get the results. I guess my next question is, do you think you can possibly forgive Sue and let this go even if you are not the baby's real father? Tony asked hopefully. I noticed she used the term the baby, and not calling her by name as she had every time before. Tony was not a bit naive and read me well, but she obviously had her hopes. A glance at my own mother showed me she had already surmised my intentions, and while she understood, was not happy. To tell you the truth, I'm not sure I can let this go even if I am the father, I admitted. I've had just over a week to think this through. This was not a mistake like a one-night stand after getting drunk. This was a 6-month affair. I can no longer trust her. She not only showed her blatant disrespect for me and our marriage, she knew full well the risk of getting knocked up by that asshole, as we were actively trying for a baby. She told the whole family we decided to try to get pregnant. Her continuing to screw Clive shows me she simply did not care which of us got her pregnant. "Have you considered marriage counseling?" Mom asked. I guess she brought this up to get ahead of arguments from Susan's family. "And I want you to consider the baby. It is not her fault. That little girl is going to need a dad. Even if you are not her actual father, you could still be her daddy." Just like I said, Mom, I don't think counseling will do a bit of good. The only piece of information I want to know is where I failed as a husband. There had to be something I did or did not do for Susan to cheat. And it's not like she was really looking to replace me. Clive has a reputation as a ladies' man. He'd never want to marry her, and I'm sure she knew that. I was trying to avoid the words that came to mind, like kitty hound, scumbag, asshole. Neither of these women deserved to have me go off on them, but I was on edge and about to blow. Other than a good F. I stopped myself again, a good time in bed or a little extra excitement on the side, I can't really see it. I thought we had a good thing. You can imagine how I've felt since I found out. Like you said, Mom, I'd been on a high thinking I was going to be a father. Then last week I get blown out of the water. My whole world exploded. To be honest, right now I hope I am not the father. Both women looked shocked at that statement. Then I don't have to be a part-time dad. To be honest, I'm not sure I can stand to deal with Susan even if the baby is mine. That alone will take some serious counseling. The nurse came out of the room. "Mr. Fontenot, your wife would like to speak with you. She said she knew you were still here or her mother would have come back by now." The nurse was sympathetic with my feelings as well, or at least seemed so. She still stopped me to say, "If you go back in there, I hope you can stay relatively calm. I know you are upset, but try not to agitate her too much. We'd really prefer to not have to sedate her. She is due to be discharged this afternoon. Plus it will not be good to have extra meds that might get transferred to the baby via her milk. And from your childbirth classes, I know you are aware of how important the colostrum and early mother's milk is to boost the baby's immune system." I nodded. Now she was appealing to my concern for the child's well-being, whether it was mine or not. "Go talk to her," Mom suggested gently. "Tony and I will go have a cup of coffee. Give me your car keys. We'll transfer the car seat. I'll wait for you to finish talking. Oh, and on your way out, stop by the nursery and take a good look at Connie. I think she looks a lot like you did when you were born." "Wishful thinking, Mom. Or are you seeing what you expected to see?" I asked. She shrugged. I could tell she was not at all happy with how things appeared. I also knew if I was the father, she'd be right there to help raise the baby whether I had much to do with Susan or not. She had been as heavily invested in being a grandmother as I was to be a father. I could tell she had not come to grips that the kid might not be her grandchild. I stepped into the room. Susan took one look at me and burst into tears again. "You must hate me," she sobbed. "No, I don't hate you. That's the problem. I hate what you did and I am so pissed off I can't see straight," I said in as quiet a voice as I could muster. I wanted to slap the piss out of her and walk away. If it were not for the slim possibility of the baby being mine, I would have left already. Plus I wanted a few answers. Do you really want to talk now, or do you want a few extra days to think about how you want to spin this story? I said with an obvious edge to my voice. I don't need a few days, Susan began when I cut her off despite my wanting answers. Yeah, you've had 9 months to think about what you might say if I ever found out about you cheating with that custard, Clive Adams. Clive Adams of all ducking people. I seethed. I stopped to take a few deep breaths. No, I really did not consider he might be the daddy. That was you. I was having our baby, not his. Susan said. You baby. I just might be the father, but that is doubtful. To give her credit, she looked shocked. Oh, come on. I was still offshore on a rig the first week in July when you supposedly got pregnant. At least most of it as I got back towards the end of the week. I checked back and looked at my work schedules for that time frame to make sure. Yeah, I remember we made up for lost time and screwed like monkeys as soon as I got home like we usually do. Or rather did. I thought that's how we got you pregnant. That's what I told the guys at work later. I had no idea Clive was putting it to you at the same time. Susan began to protest. I cut her off. Alright, the weeks before, right up until I got off the helicopter. Did you have him over at the house while I was gone? Move him in. Did you duck him in our bed? Not that it matters where you screwed him, just that you did. No. Susan exclaimed. He never came to the house except those few times when we hosted barbecues and invited people from work. We were very careful. We would not risk a neighbor seeing him or a strange car at the house. But you were not careful enough to not get pregnant. I'm betting he did not use condoms. So you can't claim one broke. Clive hits me as a guy to take risks or at least push the envelope, as long as he comes out on top. I did get checked for STDs this past week. I suggest you get screened anyway. I said. Barely audible, Susan muttered it was part of her early pregnancy examinations. I didn't think that is routine. I offered, a little surprised. I told my doctor I wanted to make sure you hadn't caught something while away on business. Susan said, sheepishly. I'd spent 2 or 3 weeks on one oil rig or another and then 2 weeks home. Sometimes, my time home got cut short if there was a problem I needed to troubleshoot. I was well compensated for my time away, so it was never an issue. Until now. I stared at her. So your OB-GYN thinks I may have been the one cheating. You gave her that impression instead of coming clean. I know my face was hot. What her doctor thought was really low on the totem pole, but it still irritated me. Susan was ready to project her own cheating onto me. I have a few questions I'd really like answered. The first is why. What made you want to screw somebody else? The second is why him? And why would you risk letting Clive knock you up? Why didn't you go back on the pill and just say you wanted to wait longer before trying for a baby, so you could screw him without the risk? I was trying really hard to not get angry. I don't know. I was lonely. You were gone a lot. I needed you and Clive was there. We started talking and next thing I knew we were having sex. I knew he was not interested in a long-term relationship. As the next question, I'd already started seeing Clive before we decided I'd go off my birth control. He hates condoms. I doubt after I had sex with him to lessen the risk a bit. I know that is not the best preventative, but I thought it'd be the best way. Keeping your legs together in the first damn place would have been a better way. I muttered sarcastically. Susan looked like she'd been slapped. I hoped she would not shut down on me before I had my other questions answered. So you cheated on me for about 4 months before you actually got pregnant. And continued for 2 more afterwards. I offered, just to move the conversation on. Susan nodded. I suspected I was pregnant, but I did not want to give up the sex until I was sure. I sort of rationalized it by telling myself if I was already pregnant, it didn't matter if I kept seeing him. I heard you tell our moms Clive broke it off with me. That was true. He did not want to keep risking you'd catch us, and he'd be stuck supporting the baby if it was his. So you discussed the possibilities with him, I said. Susan nodded. Of course. We both figured you'd never realize Connie wasn't yours, and there was a great chance she is. When you got home that first week in July, we screwed all the time. Clive and I did not see each other at all when you were home, Susan reported. So you had sex with Clive whenever I was offshore, earning a living so I could pay for that big house where we were going to raise our family, and that fancy car you just loved to drive. Did you start an affair to get back at me for being away? Or, I started to say were you just a horny slut, but curbed my tongue. Did he have a bigger clock or was his ducking you just that much better? She'd answered the question before, but it still bothered me. She shook her head in denial. Of what, I was not certain. It was just sex. I was horny when you were gone. Clive and I only had sex when you were out of town. We went to his house 3 or 4 evenings a week. We were really careful. I didn't stay over all the time. And I tried to make it appear I was mostly home. We never did anything at work to let on we were more than friendly coworkers. We never took off early or anything like that. I'd pull into his garage so nobody saw me. And no, his clock is not bigger at all, and he is not any better at sex. We never did anything you and I don't do on a regular basis. It was just he was there when you weren't. It was fun and exciting. That's about the best way to describe it. And no, I didn't do it to get back at you. It was something I did for me. It started because I was a little lonely and you know how much I like sex. Clive was putting the moves on me, and I was mildly flattered. He convinced me, or I convinced myself, there was no harm if you never knew. I was totally yours when you were home. Now that got my goat. No matter how many times she said it or how she rationalized it, I could not accept it. If you were mine only when I was home, you were not totally mine. I said with what I hoped was an even stare. You were married to me but somebody else's slut. I could not suppress saying that. You were very careful to not get caught. But then you got pregnant. I suppose you never thought of a couple things. What I might do if someday I found out our oldest child was not mine. Like through some fluke such as a difference in blood type. Or her not looking like our other kids. And that was even if you did not cheat on me again and let some new guy knock you up the next time. Or go back to Clive for another kid. I added bitterly. Susan shook her head frantically. No. I vowed never to mess around on you again. And I knew once you bonded, you would never leave Connie even if you weren't the sperm donor. Look how you've been acting. Like our mom said, you were already totally invested in that baby. Clive agreed. Couple things. I suppose you kept talking to Clive about the possibility he was the father. You said he called yesterday to check on you. And obviously you two discussed how to handle me to keep me in the dark, and my possible reaction in the future. Susan began to wring her hands. And the operative word was as in I was invested in being that baby's daddy. Both moms noticed I have not once held her. I have not changed her diaper, nor swaddled her. I have not even got much more than a quick look at her from several feet away. I'll try to change that if the DNA test shows I'm the father after all. Tell me something. You never really cared if I was the father, Clive, did you? I asked. I was not surprised when she answered. Well, of course I wanted you to be the father. But after I found out I was expecting, I just wanted the baby. I knew it would be cute and you would never suspect. You and Clive don't look that different. Same color, hair and build. You'd be her daddy and it would never matter. I hope to have you around more to be with both of us. You know full well I have already started cutting my time offshore. I gave up some of that great bonus money and started spending more time at the office instead, coordinating activities from there. I happily took the pay cut. You've been happy I was home more, so I thought. If my being away was such an issue, you should have said something long ago. All you would have had to do was ask. I was doing it all for you. Well, that is gonna change for sure if I am not the father. It's back to the rigs. I'm gonna work out there until I find a woman who wants to be with me and owning me. Not a slut who can't keep her wedding vows intact and her legs together when I am not around. I said hotly. Susan began to cry again. But I need you to help me take care of the baby. We are a family. What about us? We've done great for the past 7 months. I've been the best wife. I never even looked at another man. We could go to counseling. Right now, I'm not sure there isn't us anymore. We'll have to work something out if I turn out to be the father. For now I won't be around. Not until I get the DNA results. I've already moved my clothes and most of the stuff I care about keeping. That shocked her. She asked where I was going. I got an apartment. I did that last week. I wanted to wait until you had the baby before moving out. Tony is going to stay with you for the time being. My mom might help some too. I know she wants to. She is praying it's her grandbaby. I turned and walked out. Susan was crying, but not the hysterical bawling like earlier. I almost ran square into Tony and my mother, who had obviously been listening at the door. Yeah, so I listened. Sue me. Tony said. Don't go too far. Maybe you two can still reconnect, especially if Connie is yours, she added hopefully. Seriously. You said you listened. Did you not catch on to a couple very pertinent facts, like she never once said she was sorry she cheated? She has no regrets. She simply said she was lonely and horny and how unfair that was for her. She did not even seem to be concerned I may not be the father. She just expects me to pick up the pieces and accept things. That is pure ducking evil. Tony looked shocked at my vehemence. Her eyes filled with tears. Mom tried to calm things down. We moved the car seat and got it buckled in. Mom said, I'm going to pack a bag and help for a few days even if you are not the father. Sue has been my daughter for the past 6 years. I can't just give up on her yet. Now don't get me wrong. I don't condone what she did. What she did pisses me off too. If she had not just had a baby, I think both Tony and I would slap the sheep out of her for being so stupid. I told them where my new apartment was when they asked. I did not tell them I'd consulted an attorney and had already protected my half of our assets after paying off and canceling our credit cards. I simply locked our investment accounts. Neither of us could touch that money without the other a court order. I told the lawyer to draw up the papers citing adultery, even though that would not be an issue in our state. Susan might be stuck at home for the next few days, but that did not mean she could not do something with our money online. I would rather be safe than sorry. I had been 99% sure our marriage was over. The 1% was the niggling doubt because up until a week ago I'd been happily married. And that 1% had just been dumped in the trash. I knew I could never trust her again. I phoned Steve on my way home, or rather to my new apartment. Right now I could use a drinking buddy. I'd arranged to take a few weeks off work when the baby came to help get my wife get settled, the male version of maternity leave. At the moment, I did not want to be by myself. Steve could easily get away during the day, so he met me at the bar. He worked for his father-in-law's company, and did not think he'd have his job much longer anyway. Not after Cheryl's confession. "I take it you confronted Susan," he began. I nodded and told him how the conversation went down. "Well, I've been to the same lawyer you saw. Good thing is Cheryl's dad insisted on a prenup when we got married. He wanted to protect his business, and she owns a chunk of stock. Not that she gets paid any dividends or has any real say, but he needed her on the books to fulfill some kind of legal requirement as a person on the board of directors. She'll keep that stock, but I'll get almost everything else." We talked already, and he knew Susan would get half of our community property, which was a pretty decent amount. We both worked for our whole marriage, and she earned a good salary. I hoped to raise enough fuss to not have to pay her alimony. I figured Tony might help with that. And child support was only an issue if the baby was mine. I still had my doubts. "I'm gonna get stung," I groused. "The courts are gonna nail me even though I did nothing wrong." Larry and I went to see Don Ducat, Sandy's husband, and told him about his wife and Clive. Steve said. Like I figured, he about blew a gasket. Larry, being a cop, warned him about doing anything stupid. I agreed. Don was pissed at us and couldn't believe we were going to let Clive get away with making us cuckolds. He called us kiddies for not kicking Clive's ass as soon as we found out. Larry surprised the sheep out of me when he said, "If the duck said anything about letting the custard get away." I said, "Don't do anything stupid. That means anything to get caught. Clive is not worth going to jail over because you do something rash." "Don may have a quick temper, but he is not dumb," Steve said. He said, "So I need to make sure I'm not caught when somebody takes Clive's balls off." We joked about that, and he calmed down enough to sit still. "You know we gotta do something to fix the son of a witch." I agree. Clive needs to be taken down, but it has to be done just right, and destroying his teeth is not the right approach. I told him how Clive had called Susan, supposedly to check on her and the baby, but to really make sure I was still in the dark. Steve looked at me like I lost my mind. "You can't let him get away with that. He can still pay child support if he is a eunuch. And he has to answer for destroying marriages. Yours, mine, and probably Don's. Larry may stay with Lana for the time being. He is on the fence because they have 2 kids. What he does depends on how Lana acts when he confronts her. He is going to do that tonight. He was only holding off on account of you." "Well, Clive is going to find out his game is up as soon as these women warn him. He might not stick around long. His problem is, he can always be found," I said. "People don't realize just how hard it is to stay off the grid. You can't earn a good income being paid cash under the table. Not one like Clive would want. Make no mistake, he's toast. But if we know of 4 women he's screwed, there has to be others. It's like looking for a needle in the haystack. If you shake a handful of hay and 4 needles pop out at your feet, the whole stack has to be full of needles. We need to find other husbands who might not be happy about his activities," I said. "Now as far as nailing his balls, no matter what, I'd rather see he keeps at least one intact and uninjured." Steve looked puzzled, so I explained. "If he loses both, he can take hormone supplements and still screw. Or he might just lose his sex drive. I'd rather his sex drive stay intact but do something to his clock. Like wrap a wire around it so it dies, or maybe smash it with a hammer. He'd stay horny but not have the equipment to do anything about it. Plus the anguish of losing his clock would be both physical and mental." Steve began to laugh. I knew eventually he would get with both Larry and Don and tell them my idea. He talked with them already and knew they were primed. Like I told him, maybe Clive had used the same sales pitch with their wives and revealed names of other lovers. We could let others know. He called Larry and Don before we left the bar. 2 days later I stopped by the house Susan and I had shared. Tony answered the door. "You didn't waste any time, did you?" she asked bitterly. Sue was served this morning. She's done nothing but cry since. The only time she seems to get a grip and can control it is when she feeds and rocks Connie. Not that I can really blame you, but I thought you were going to wait. She really is distraught. I'm sure after this shock she would never look at another man again. Do you think there is any possible hope for you two if you go to counseling? She asked me, hopefully. I shook my head. I was pretty sure there was no way forward for us as a couple, but this seals it. I handed her a copy of the paternity test. The baby is not mine. So unless she was also seeing somebody else, Clive Adams is the father. She needs to make him pay support. Tony stared at the envelope and began to cry. She was heartbroken. She finally realized her hopes and dreams had been dashed. After a final hug, she turned to break the news to her daughter. I already told my own mother the news. She was terribly upset to not be a grandmother. She decided to stay home until I got the DNA results. She was too angry with Susan's cheating to stay with Tony and Susan. She was another of Susan's and Clive's victims. The subject of Clive Adams' escapades with married women became a topic around town the next few days. When Steve, Larry and Dawn and I confronted our wives, we made no secret of who the custard was. In fact, we went out of our way to expose him. While none of us liked being known as cuckolds, we stood tall and let one and all know about our wives falling victim to the lecherous custard's lines. As it turned out, it seems he had only needed to use his winning sales pitch of revealing the identities of previous women with Cheryl. The other women simply fell for his gifted gab. Whatever their issues were, they accepted Clive's approach and apparently enjoyed what he offered, all while supposedly happily married. Once his activities became well known, fathers of babies born to women who knew him at all demanded paternity tests. I later heard of 2 of the babies that he had sired. Other men who had the barest suspicion their wives might have stepped out, grilled their wives about their activities. Several couples began counseling. The full extent of his activities was not revealed until Clive Adams himself made it known. And he did that to the police themselves. You'd have thought that a man living the lifestyle Clive had chosen would have kept his assets liquid in case he had to relocate in a hurry. But instead of putting his higher-than-average income into cash, stocks, bonds and other easily transferable forms, he bought a house and invested in multiple pieces of real estate. Even his household furnishings were lavish. He had decent pieces of art adorning his walls, along with the typical collection of hunting and fishing gear normally found in our area. His boat was rigged for water skiing as well as fishing. Of course, law enforcement would not have bothered, but even if he could have liquidated his assets and ran, he could still have been traced and hunted down by private investigators. It is difficult to completely hide when your social security number is required for any high-income, non-cash only employment, no matter how far you run geographically. Clive may have not realized the danger. He obviously underestimated the wrath of the husbands he cuckolded. He did not bother to immediately leave the area and paid the price. Only a few days after his affairs became public knowledge, he was found naked on the sidewalk in front of his house by an early morning jogger. He was in shock, moaning and barely conscious. The jogger called for emergency services immediately. She had nothing to cut the zip ties that kept Clive's hands behind his back. Clive screamed when the jogger tried to turn him over. The jogger would not have wanted to see what was revealed if she had been successful. The EMTs found Clive's left testicle had been crushed, as had most of his deck. The steel wire twisted tightly to band his deck at the base was the only thing that kept Clive from bleeding to death. Investigation found a broken and half-crushed brick in his kitchen. Forensic testing determined the round marks on what remained of the brick were from a 3-pound sledge. I learned this from Larry, the cop at the bar. He happily but at the same time solemnly explained to Steve, Dawn and me how he'd been told by 2 detectives that if he had a 3-pound hammer that might have unexplained tissue embedded, to get rid of that same tool, to drop it into the swamp. Now, I had nothing to do with pounding the asshole's clock into mush, but I am passing along the advice my fellow cops gave me. Larry stated with a barely concealed grin and a big wink. Clive had no idea who had assaulted him. He vaguely remembered answering his doorbell. Whether it was late the night before or possibly that morning, he could not remember. It was dark and he had been asleep. They used a stun gun, I guess. Clive recalled when he woke up. They shot my scrotum a few times. I remember that. I think there were 2 guys, but I'm not sure. I was pretty out of it. One said I'd never go after another married woman. After that, all I felt was pain in my groin and nothing else. Clive was understandably upset that his deck had been destroyed and wanted the guilty party arrested and convicted. To that effort, he told the investigators the names of every woman with whom he had sexual contact over the past few years. Some were married, but some were single with boyfriends. The list was surprisingly long. Having so many names to check out only muddied the water for the investigators. Although there were many suspects, there was no evidence to implicate anyone specifically. Because of the possible hour of the attack, nobody had a good alibi either. Larry told Steve and me privately. The investigating detectives felt Clive Adams got his just desserts. After a few months, the investigation eventually stalled. As expected, Susan got half our community property. The house was sold, and some other family got to move their little girl into the nursery I had so carefully painted. I hope she enjoyed my painstaking artwork of little animals on the walls. Susan moved back into her mother's home because she couldn't handle taking care of the baby on her own. At least living with Tony she would not be lonely. But I had no idea what she did for sex, nor did I care. She did phone me once to say she was sorry. I surmised Tony had jumped her about that. She did not elaborate what she was sorry about. Whether it was for cheating, for getting pregnant by another man, or for my finding out and divorcing her. I did not ask. I was beyond it at that point. When she asked if we could get together to talk, I simply said no. She did ask if I'd heard what happened to Clive, and then asked if I had anything to do with it. I simply told her he deserved it and I hung up. From that point on we never talked again and everything was handled by the lawyers. I wondered how much of her money would be wasted trying to sue Clive for child support. He would not voluntarily pay. Eventually she'd get the support of course, but having to pay a lawyer to pursue it would dip into her savings. Clive was facing multiple such suits, and I heard liens were in place to keep him from liquidating his real estate assets. Between his own medical bills, lawyer fees, and impending child support, he would not have much to live on. And that was if he managed to keep his job. 18 months later. It was 3 in the morning when I leaned against the lower rail of the Econ 626 rig in the Gulf of Mexico. The fall wind was brisk and cool, but my light windbreaker was enough to keep me comfortable. This was going to be one of my last regular trips to the rigs. I'd met a woman and decided she was worth pursuing. We got along great. I had no idea if our relationship would go anywhere, but I was now in the mindset to consider the possibility. It was time to accept the position I'd been offered and turned down twice at headquarters. I unzipped my light jacket and touched the lump hanging over my belt. I had no idea why I'd held onto it for so long. I tried to throw it away several times but never did. The risk of keeping it was too great and totally irrational, but somehow holding it made me feel better. Like I'd taken my own back. Before I could consider it anymore, I pulled the heavy hammer out of its concealment and dropped it into the sea.